Hello class 9. Today I am starting with the next chapter, pollination and fertilization of flowers. Now last two classes we have discussed about the structure of flower. Now we will go through a very important phenomenon which is known as pollination and fertilization in flower. First you see what is pollination we need to know. Clear? First we'll go through the definition. In your book, this definition is very clearly given. It is the process of transference of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. You all know that we have already discussed this structure of stamen, where we have seen that there are two main components, anther and filament. And within the anther sacs, anther lobes, there are many pollen sacs present which contain these pollen grains, which are actually the male cells of a flower. Now these pollen grains transfers from the anther to the stigma of another flower. Then we call the process to be pollination. Now pollination can be of various types. One is autogamy. The pollen of the same flower may fall on its stigma by itself. Then it is self-pollination. We also call it as autogamy, which can take place automatically. The pollen of another flower of the same plant may fall on the stigma. That means it may be the same plant, but it is not the same flower. It is another flower on the same plant. We call it as geitonogamy. Next is allogamy. The pollen of a flower of another plant of the same species may fall on the stigma. This is known as allogamy, or this is the actual cross-pollination. So this should be another plant. Definitely a different flower. But one thing you have to keep in mind, it should be of the, what you should keep in mind? It should be of the same species. Clear? Now you see in this picture they have shown autogamy, that means within the same flower. Geitonogamy, that means within the same plant but different flower, as you can see here. Geitonogamy. Okay. This autogamy and geitonogamy both are self-pollination. Clear? Because it is involving only one plant. And allogamy is the cross-pollination where we are involving two plants. When two plants are involved. Clear? Now we'll come to the self-pollination part. It is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. This is the definition of self-pollination. Please mark it. This is the definition of self-pollination. Pollination between flowers of the same plant is considered self-pollination on account of the common genetic characters. That is, the general qualities or features of any one plant are the same in the different flowers borne on it, because it is the same plant. So as many flowers are present in that plant, all the flowers will carry the same genetic characters. Now there is an exception. In some rare cases, as in pansy, some flowers growing close to the ground level do not open at all. The anthers and stigma lie close to each other, which mature at the same time, and self-pollination is assured. This kind of phenomenon is known as cleistogamy, where the flowers do not open. They are always closed. Cleisto means closed. So if the flower is not opening, then definitely self-pollination is the only way. It cannot come out, the pollen grains cannot come out from the anthers outside. So cross-pollination is not possible in any case. Now when can self-pollination occur? Self-pollination can occur in bisexual flowers. That means we have already read in the last chapter about the hermaphrodite flowers, about the unisexual, about the bisexual flowers where both male and female organs are present in the same flower. Or it can also occur in such unisexual flowers where both male and female flowers are born on the same plant. That means plants should be the same on which the unisexual flowers are present. To ensure self-pollination, it is necessary that the anther and stigma of a flower must mature at the same time. Or if the flowers are unisexual and born on the same plant, then they must also mature at the same time. So this is third point. First point, there should be a bisexual flower. Second point, if unisexual flowers are present, then they must born on the same plant. And if they are bisexual or unisexual, anther and stigma of a flower must mature at the same time. These are the 3 points you must remember that when can self-pollination occur. Now, what are the advantages of self-pollination? It is a much surer way in such bisexual flowers where stamens and carpels mature at the same time. It is a surer process that definitely fertilization will occur. Parental characters are preserved indefinitely because they are of the same genetic constitution, born in the same plant. There is no wastage of pollen grains because it do not have to travel a distance from one plant to the other plant. It's the same plant. The flowers need not to be large and showy to attract the insects because it is the same flower which is involved. Scent and nectar need not be produced by flowers because again attraction for the insects is not a necessary aspect. But there are disadvantages also. Like first one, it weakens the variety or the species because generation after generation self-pollination is occurring, and this continued self-pollination can lead to a weakened variety production or a weakened species production. Secondly, the weaker or defective characters, if any, are present in that particular variety, it cannot be eliminated because the same varieties are preserved generation after generation, the same characters. It can be defective characters are preserved generation after generation. And thirdly, it does not yield new varieties because the same genetic traits with no change, without any intermixing, are passed on to the next generation. Okay, so there is no yield of new varieties, new types with new variations. Clear? So these are the 3 disadvantages of self-pollination. Next is the definition of cross-pollination. It is the transfer of pollen from the anthers of flowers of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant. This is the definition of cross-pollination. Now, advantages. The offspring are healthier because there are variations of genetic characters. The seeds produced must be very abundant and viable. New varieties may be produced by cross-pollinating 2 different varieties of the same species. So definitely, because we are getting new varieties from this cross-pollination, we are getting healthier offspring and the seeds are produced in abundance. Disadvantages, it is not always a certain process because it depends upon the pollinating agents like air, water, insects, and in that case maybe it is not traveling properly from one plant to the other plant. So definitely it is not a surer process, it is not always a certain process. Secondly, the pollen has to be produced in large quantity to ensure chances of pollination, which means a lot of wastage of pollen. When the pollen is traveling from one flower to the other flower, to from one plant to the other plant, a certain distance they are traveling, right? And that is why there may be wastage of pollen grains. The process is uneconomical for the plant because the flowers have to be large, colored, scented, and have to produce nectar. So definitely so many characters have to be there in order to bring out the cross pollination. So it is a very uneconomical process for the plant. because the flowers must carry these characters. Clear? Now, difference is given between self pollination and cross pollination in your book. Please go through these points. At least 5 points you have to learn. At least 5 points. Self pollination and cross pollination difference. Clear? Now, we'll come to some points like how nature favors cross pollination. First of all, unisexuality. The flowers may be either male or female and they may be born on separate plants. In this way, cross pollination is the only possibility. Example, palms and papaya. So, in that case, cross pollination have to occur. Okay. Different timings of maturation of androecium and gynoecium. We call this process as decogamy. In many bisexual flowers, the anthers and stigma of the same flower mature at different times. As we have read just now in self-pollination that the androecium and gynoecium must mature at the same time. That is why self-pollination was favored. Now here we are going through a process known as decogamy where the anther and stigma are maturing at the different times. So definitely self-pollination is not possible. Cross-pollination has to occur, and in that case we have got two cases. One is protandry, another is protogyny. Pro means earlier. Protandry means when the androecium is maturing earlier. Anthers are maturing earlier than the stigma. Example, sweet pea, sunflower. And in some plants, protogyny, that means earlier maturation of the gynoecium. The stigma of the flower matures earlier than the anthers. Example, custard apple, people. Two examples for each you have to learn. Next is self-sterility. This is a condition in which even if the stigma receives pollen from the anthers of the same flower, the pollen fails to undergo further growth. In such cases, only the pollen from different plants of the same species can effectively complete the process of setting of the seeds. Like we can find it in ray florets of sunflower. It's a very common example. And self-sterility means when there is some genetic abnormality in the plant, even if the pollen grains are coming from the same plant's flower, it is not able to fertilize it, to pollinate it, and that is why it is always uh, supporting or favoring cross pollination. Clear? Another important phenomenon which we have to learn here is harcogamy. That means some kind of a mechanical barrier. It's a very rare case, but in some flowers the pollen of a flower cannot reach the stigma of the same flower. Why? Because there is a barrier. They have given one example, you see, a hood covering the stigma acts as a mechanical barrier in pansy flower. Pansy flower, we can see a hood, a barrier, an obstacle which is covering the stigma and acting as a mechanical barrier in order to uh, pollinate the flowers. Okay, so this is one of the rarest example. Heterostyly, in such flowers the stigma and anthers grow at different heights, which does not favor self pollination. That means maybe it is always favored when the anther is at the top and stigma is at the bottom. But if sometimes it happens that anther is at the bottom, stigma is at the top, then it's very difficult for the pollens to fall. So that is why when there are different heights and that height is not favoring it, then it does not favor self-pollination and it favors cross-pollination. Example, primrose, oxalis, etc. Now here oxalis is a scientific name, so whenever you are writing it, you must underline it and you should start with a capital O. Clear? So students, today up to this, we'll continue this chapter again in the next class. Please go through your textbook because you have your textbook from the previous class only, and please go through the two chapters which I've completed. One is flower, another is this pollination and fertilization. Okay, next day we'll again do the rest part of the chapter. Thank you.